There's a change to the program. One of our speakers for this panel is ill and is not able to be with us, unfortunately, so that would be Dr. Tom Wong from UC San Diego. So we will have 2 presentations, and then we'll be breaking after the second presentation for about an hour before we reconvene for the screening of film or a couple of documentaries from Louis Messiah. And that will be, so we'll reconvene downstairs in the screening room an hour after we break. Okay, so to introduce our next speaker, Michael Gomez was recently named the Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, having served as the founding director of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora from its inception in 2000 to 2007. He's currently series editor of the Cambridge Studies of the African Diaspora, Cambridge University Press. He has chaired the history departments at both New York University and Spelman College, and has served as president of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project from 2009 to 2011. His first book, Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad, the Pre-Colonial State of Bundu, Senegal, Pre-Colonial State of Bundu, examines Muslim polity in what is now Eastern Senegal. He's got 4 books. I will read through them. The second book is Exchanging Our Country Marks, the Transformations of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South, which is concerned with questions of culture and race. Reversing Sails, A History of the African Diaspora, in 2005, is more fully involved with the idea of an African diaspora, as is Diasporic Africa, a reader, which was also published in 2006. Then there's also Black Crescent, African Muslims in the Americas from 2005, which examines how African Muslims negotiated bondage and freedom throughout the Americas, allowing for a significant integration of Islamic Africa. His new book, scheduled to be released this year, is titled African Dominion in Savannah and Sahel, A New History of Early and Medieval West Africa. And so this is a extended study, comprehensive study of polity and religion during the West African region, sort of iconic and much storied collective moment. Professor Gomez is invested in an Arabic manuscript project in Mali, which was disrupted by war recently, and is arguably one of the most this Arabic manuscript project is arguably one of the most important endeavors of its kind in the 20th and 21st centuries. Gomez remains supportive of the struggles of people of African descent worldwide. So we're very excited to have him here with us, a scholar of great range and depth of research in both African and African diaspora history and in thinking about the relations that are evolving between the two. And his talk today is titled, A Different Kind of Migration, The African's Journey into Liminality. So welcome.
Thank you, Professor Benjamin. It's really a pleasure to be back on Riverside's campus. I seem to come through every once in a while here, and those visits have been very, very important. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take my jacket off because it's very warm. So it's good to see Professor Benjamin and my former student, Adimade, who's on your faculty. And I am delighted to be united once again with my friend and mentor, Professor Sterling Stuckey. So I'm going to read In W.E.B. Du Bois's oft surprising and highly revelatory novelistic venture, Dark Princess, or Romance, published in 1928, the protagonist, Matthew Towns, leaves the United States for Berlin, having been denied the opportunity to pursue obstetrics at the University of Manhattan, undoubtedly a reference to Martin Delany being forced to leave Harvard Medical School in 1850 after only 3 weeks matriculation in the face of petitioning white students. In Berlin, he meets the Dark Princess, quote unquote, over tea, and in waiting for her later in her dining room, feels his heart swell. For the first time since he had left New York, we are told, he felt himself a man, one of those who could help build a world and guide it. In 1934, the very real Chicago-born Louise Thompson, who along with Houston-born Thyra Edwards had entered into the worlds of radical politics and homosocial community, traveled to the Soviet Union where, the historian Eric McDuffie writes, they experienced, quote, a euphoric sense of personal freedom from American racism. Thompson is quoted as avowing, Russia was the only place where I was able to forget that I was a Negro. As the cultural historian Sterling Stuckey has written, Paul Robeson, born in 1898 in Princeton, New Jersey, and whose own father escaped from slavery in North Carolina, was educated at both Rutgers and Columbia School of Law. But it was not until 1927, when moving with his spouse Eslanda to London, he underwent a similar epiphany. In an April 1955 interview in Fighting Talk, he would reveal, I discovered Africa in London, reflecting a deep immersion into the cultures and communities there. In 1934, he would write an essay entitled, I Want to Be an African, in which he characterized the African American as a tragic creature, a man without a nationality. Professor Stuckey writes about this extensively. In strikingly similar fashion, by the end of his travels to Africa and the Middle East in 1964, Malcolm X had acquired the honorific title and new name, El Hadji Amawali, a conjunction of the one who made the pilgrimage and the child who has come home. As the late eminent scholar Manning Marable has demonstrated, Malcolm's time in Africa was certainly influential in expanding his understanding of the conjoined struggles of African people. But it was his pilgrimage to Mecca that initiated the quintessential breakthrough. As recorded in the autobiography, he would contend, in my 39 years on this earth, the holy city of Mecca has been the first time I had ever stood before the Creator and felt like a complete human being. The foregoing are but a few examples of black folks' reflections upon exiting their land of birth. Their reassessments have a visceral quality, suggesting a deep desire or impulse within the subconscious, actively rejecting incessant negation while patiently awaiting opportunities to more fully engage processes of reevaluation and validation, confirming a resolute but perhaps inchoate perspective of interiority. The resonances between their responses, rather than formulaic, are far more representative of a common struggle, forming a sort of trope. Key to these experiences is alternate space, within which assumptions and purported verities could be challenged. In the foregoing instances, those spaces were in fact geographic locations, extending beyond America's cultural and political dominion, which speaks to how damaging and disorienting and disaggregating the historical experiences of African Americans have been. Far from the celebration of a common humanity, I think I'm about to break this. Far from the celebration of a common humanity and shared dignity, the American story has largely been one of differential equations, of polarization and dehumanization, of contrast and inversion. The long struggle for freedom and equality has been accompanied by a quest for approbation, an approbation that may never be conferred. As we all appreciate, Du Bois understood this challenge, as he was one of the first to articulate its substance. In his 1903 classic Souls of Black Folk, he speaks of the Negro's peculiar sensations, double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness as an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This is, of course, one of the most famous passages in all of scholarship, yet it is critical in understanding the epiphanies of Malcolm and Thompson and Robeson. And when it comes to black women, Du Bois's concept of double consciousness must be expanded to accommodate the intersectionality of triple consciousness and beyond. Indeed, the variables of race, class, and gender and sexual orientation mean that multiple consciousness, while collective, is also individuated, even though there's something more to learn in revisiting Du Bois's original idea. To be sure, much has been said regarding double consciousness, but I often wonder what Du Bois himself meant by the concept. For some, resolution to a formulation as enigmatic as opaque is found in the Tunis principle, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. That is, the American Negro was a disjointed, fractured individual unable to fully merge oppositional constructs. Although the relationship between multiple consciousness and Tunis is certainly there, I am less sanguine that they are immediately collapsible, that they refer to the same phenomenon. Rather, I believe that Du Bois refers to a single condition that issues into and thus explains another. Allow me to develop my hermeneutic. Careful scholar that he was, Du Bois wrote to be understood, taking time to define his terms. In this instance, he characterizes double consciousness as this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. That is, the core issue of double consciousness is the mediation of the self-perspective, the acquisition of self-knowledge through mechanisms controlled by a hostile other. To state it differently, the American Negro in Du Bois's analysis was in the predicament of learning about herself, about her native potential, her intelligence, her beauty, her historical contributions, her social standing and value to society, and her future prospects through a prism of American racism. He was taught that as a member of a despised and degraded race, he was locked ontologically into inferiority and servility. This is a Western version of caste, deeply embedded in nearly every aspect of the American experience, with pedagogical tools and strategies extending well beyond the schoolhouse. Limited opportunities, differential pay scales, constricted workspaces convey that message. The prescription of movement within public facilities, restaurants, courthouses, and means of transportation throughout the land of Jim Crow certainly reinforced the lesson. The circumstances of residence and social interaction, a quartering of black folk, whether at rest or in motion, engineered demographic patterns so dramatic and stark as to even provide a template for South African apartheid. The arrogation of power by a few, the projection of white iconography, indeed the very imagery associated with divine unction, all attested to the sanctioning of order and futility of remonstration. In contrast, the image of the African descendant was that of the coon, the shine, the buffoon, the criminal, with the object lesson dangling from a tree. In further pursuit of Du Bois's meaning, in presenting the core dilemma of black folk and in approximating the bearing of their souls, Du Bois borrows the concept of the two-headed Negro, the specially gifted person, seventh in the birth order and born with a call, confirmations of an otherworldly choice by which the chosen has been empowered to peer into interstitial spaces of sacred and profane, spirit and flesh, time and before time, to locate the cause of disease and trouble and discord. But instead of seeing into the unknown, those born with a veil and gifted with second sight are, by Du Bois's formulation, in fact visually impaired. For as a consequence of their circumstance of birth, their vantage point yields them no true self-consciousness. Rather, they know as they are known. To be sure, there is every evidence that many African descended persons completely rejected the idea of their innate inferiority, instead nurturing convictions of self-worth and beauty and promise in tandem with an autonomous locus of cogitation, proving impervious to the psychological and physical forays and assaults of American racialism. Du Bois himself is an example of this. But in following Du Bois's previous trajectory, it is only logical that some, if not many, would succumb to assault and internalize that message. The African American's disorientation, as identified by Du Bois, is the defining feature of her experience in North America. The notion of the irreconcilability at the core of the dilemma. It can be argued by extension that the African diaspora is the quintessential imagined community within which a 500-year conversation has been ongoing in myriad languages and cultural expressions over the meaning of loss and displacement. Broadly conceived and not limited to black folk, there are and have been many diasporas. Diasporas of cultural, ethnic, racial, religious communities, in some instances converging and occupying proximate positions. We have arguably called these diasporas by other names. European colonialism comes to mind as a candidate. With respect to the African experience, a set of experiences that we continue to call the one colonialism and the other diaspora is itself very instructive. The former is associated with power, advantage, mastery, the spread of civilization, scientific and technological progress, so forth. Diaspora, on the other hand, is the backside of that story, the flip side of the coin, the unappreciated context for the building of the Panama Canal, the overlooked aspect of the emergence of manufacturing and shipping in the American North, etc. It features the lives of those whose labor added exponentially to the glories of the ancien regime, those inhabitants of the Medinas and favelas, these millions who struggled simply to breathe. Diaspora is the underbelly of the beast and is concerned with civilization's human costs, striving to remember what the narrative of progress seeks to forget. And what is truly arresting in the diasporic story, what is both unsettling if not threatening, is that it recreates these experiences as constitutive of linked communities that, while derivative of imperial and colonial interventions, are not simply subsidiary to them, but exist in and of their own right. The colors and sounds of diaspora are therefore tempered with darker hues and melancholic refrains, born of experience more so than physiognomy. Loss is at the core of these sights and sounds. The loss of home, family, friends, security, health. The transatlantic slave trade, as an example, represents the ultimate mechanism of separation from the familiar and in the introduction to the absurd, fundamentally a 400-year saga of trauma. The navigation of the lands of the macabre, in turn, reflect the dilemma of these traumas. As the vast majority had no means of returning home, their descendants necessarily undertaking the difficult work of reconsidering the land of rejection as somehow home or not. This created all sorts of tensions with enslaved and the emancipated facing seemingly intractable contradictions. They were enslaved, but now are free. But free to do what? To be what? Given their non-citizenship status, based upon conditions they could not change. The conditions and legacies of bondage and non-bondage as opposed to freedom, a qualified exile with potential for achieving either some level of recreation of home in societies with black majorities, or a measure of liberty in societies with black minorities, constituted an indeterminacy of belonging, yet another hallmark of the diasporic plight, with resolution of the problem approached from a variety of angles, from acquiescence to agitation for full citizenship to withdrawal of emotional and psychic investment. Wrestling with the present in light of the past and anticipation of an uncertain future, a pervasive restlessness characterizes the exilic dimension of diaspora in its negation of the arguably irreconcilable. In whatever manner the search for remedies to the dilemma of sojourn is undertaken, there awaits for every person the need to confront the issue of return. Stated differently, each person will have to answer the question most famously phrased in County Cullen's Heritage, which begins with the query, what is Africa to me? To be sure, for some, if not many, the answer is that Africa means nothing whatsoever, an effective distancing from the continent. But for others, the question persists. It is there. It will always be there, searching for the means of return of some sort, in some dimension, whether physical or of short or long durée, or in the form of a spiritual and psychological quest, or even a cultural embrace, or some combination thereof. But of course, the great conundrum has been the unattainable nature of the polarities. Africa, once lost, has yet to be recovered, whereas America, as an ideal, has yet to become home. This is the essence of the African diaspora, of Du Bois's Tunis. This inability to achieve wholeness of spirit and vision, this desire to be made whole, this yearning to overcome the debilitation of a fractured consciousness. It should therefore come as no surprise that the forced displacement of persons would result in the search for a return to equilibrium, to the organization of a social ensemble in which, to the furthest extent possible, wrongs are righted, wounds are healed, and dignity is restored. It is to an early age of such recovery that Malcolm refers when saying that during the pilgrimage he felt like a complete human being for the first time in his life. Diaspora is a means by which the gulf might be forded. As a cultural construct and academic project, it features competing visions. One approach, for example, is to locate diaspora's origins with the beginning of European expansion, and that as a consequence of their immersion in the cultures of Europe, diaspora is but a part of Western civilization, that the person of African, or for that matter, Asian or autochthonous descent in the Americas is only an extension of the American imagination, of the Western imagination. If not a most splendid example of its creativity and ability to reproduce itself in variegated form. As such, there is really nothing African about the diaspora save its obvious origins in the continent. That is, the very concept of the African diaspora is deeply and inextricably wedded to the rise of the West, with all else either having been virtually obliterated or of quaint consequence. As such an interpretation privileges power and might, it is not an analysis of what actually happens when communities of diverse cultures meet and engage in all sorts of exchange. Even within context of the most extreme of political social disequilibria, which is precisely what the transatlantic trade in human beings was, the exchanges are significant and extensive. Languages, religious expression and beliefs, agricultural and mining techniques, skills, building techniques and spatial orientations, culinary tastes, musical genres, the adornment of the body, et cetera, and so forth, all are affected and in multiple directions, to say nothing of the exchange of genetic code. And though English or French or Portuguese may operate as official languages, they no longer sound the same, as they are infused with inflections and rules of conjugation owing to African sensibilities. Power, in tandem with language as a written medium, helps to explain why these languages were not utterly transformed. Before embracing any particular interpretation of these experiences, the historian of the African diaspora sits before a vast array of information, culled from archives and repositories, from interviews with subjects living and dead, from material culture as well as sonic memory. She is fluent with the historiography, the ways in which the history has been discussed over the years and generations, while mindful of the attendant debates, controversies, and issues awaiting resolution. Her objective is to create a coherent narrative informed by the evidentiary base and in a manner as creative and as innovative as possible, so as to make a genuine contribution, to say something new about something old, to intervene into the historiography in a fresh and meaningful way. To accomplish this, she must arrive at a central thesis. She must make an original claim for which she marshals her materials. This is the craft of the historian. This is what we do. But in so doing, it is not possible to bring something of ourselves into the process. For the historian is participant in all facets of society, including the public square. As is true of the physician, the judge, the police officer, he has political views and a set of mores. He has been affected by life experiences, and is embedded in a set of social relations. So as he weaves his account of the past, he brings to the work his collection of personal experiences, political views, religious beliefs, and values, which converge to influence the production of the work, from what factual evidence is included, to what is sublimated or completely ignored, to the argument itself, from its tone and phrasing to its very substance. We would like to think that the historian is above all of this, that by virtue of his training and commitment to rigor and impartiality, he is impervious to circumstances of the personal and political, but this is neither a logical nor productive set of assumptions. At the same time, it is not altogether a ruinous condition, as it is part of what makes history and his writing so invigorating and enlivening. These observations are nowhere more in evidence than in the dearth of the histories of the Americas, or Europe for that matter, in which Africa and Africans actually feature, where they are more than scaffolding or points in a primordial past after which, a la Exile, they are no more to be mentioned, or only mentioned in association with pandemic disease, drought and famine, natural disasters, exacerbated by seemingly incessant war, political instability, and intractable impoverishment. This has been our socialization, something from which Paul Robeson and Louise Thompson sought to escape. To address the egregious, the historian of the Americas or Europe must necessarily engage the Africanist literature, but one should proceed with caution. As is true of any field, there are ongoing and unresolved controversies and debates in this literature, and as I read the most recent publications, they tend to be infused with a certain meta-language, a lingua franca that by its very appropriation frames critical questions, employing terminology that effectively establishes the terms or parameters of debate. Allow me to develop my own forensics into this matter. To be sure, most Africanist historical literature is focused on the colonial and post-colonial turn, understandable in that it bears directly upon contemporary issues while allowing Africanists to articulate with scholarship concerned with similar phenomena elsewhere. but consideration of antecedent historiographic trends is critical to understanding these recent trends. Scholarly writing on Africa goes back to at least the 19th century, and in the Anglophone world was largely pioneered by such Pan-Africanists as Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnet, and Edward Blyden. These were visionaries with vested interest in Africa as a motherland or fatherland, to which the enslaved and formerly enslaved should aspire to return. Their interests and line of reasoning were adopted by such titans as Du Bois, who argued for placing Africa within a global context as a source, if not the very font, of civilization. Du Bois's work is exemplary, given the period and limited resources, as he sought to relocate the view and valuation of the African from one of deprivation and disrespect, placing the African on more of an equal footing with Europe and Asia. Du Bois as activist and scholar, was well known within many circles, but his work was for the most part rejected and ignored by the established academy. Instead, the study of Africa would become professionalized with colonialism's expansion. The earliest scholarly work intimately associated with the colonial project, indeed often written by colonial officers. But these early ethnographers were not simply recording what they found, they were actually also inventing concepts that came to be accepted as quote-unquote African, such as notions of customary law, the expansion or restriction of political authority, the rise of whole new ethnicities. Meanwhile, the metropoles were creating nations with arbitrary and, in too many instances, nonsensical borders that continue to bedevil African politics and society. It was against this background, wherein notions of backward tribes and atavistic cultures were deeply embedded, and for which the only remedy was the civilizing mission, that the so-called nationalist period of Africanist historiography emerges. Writing in the 1960s and 70s, both Western and African scholars emphasized African capacity and promise, often focusing on past African states and empires as indicative of what could be. Writing at the height of anti-colonial struggles and newly achieved independence, their efforts were in lockstep with those in Asia and the Caribbean, as well as the struggle for human rights and dignity in the United States. The hopes and dreams of the 1960s and 70s, however, soon collided with the realities of the late 1970s and 80s, with Western orchestrated imprisonment, assassination, the exile of visionary leaders who were replaced by henchmen who would remain in power for decades, bleeding their countries dry by shifting economic fortunes in which prices for primary goods and commodities fell precipitously, while oil prices rose exponentially, by politics so thoroughly roiled by unrealistic expectations of states whose constituencies bore little to no historical relationship to each other, by corrupt and inept leaders who thieved the wealth and patrimony of their constituencies, all with the knowledge and support of Western donors who themselves benefited by loans offered at unconscionably exorbitant interest rates, and by an international business community steadfastly refusing to invest in the productive capacity of the continent, relying instead on extractive industries while relocating manufacturing to Asia and Latin America. Recipes for utter failure. These measures were followed by the IMF and World Bank in the 1990s. Their prescriptions for cleaning up a mess for which the West was arguably largely responsible. Their structural adjustment programs essentially calling for the gutting of human services and cessation of subsidizing currencies in the belief that the free market would resolve all of Africa's woes, the forerunner to neoliberalism, only increased social misery and frustration. The void left by the West is now being filled by China, who in exchange for infrastructural projects is being given breathtakingly wide access to land and resources. But the basic formula whereby Africa exports raw materials in exchange for someone else's finished products, absent investment in the productive capacities of African people, continues. The disappointments of the 1970s and 80s are reflected in the so-called Afro-pessimism that crept into the scholarship, lamenting Africa's seemingly intractable woes and relocating the causes. This was also a response to dependency of world systems theory, in which the developing world's challenges were laid squarely at the feet of industrialized nations. And as a consequence, more than the disruption of external forces, scholars began to fault Africa and Africans for their troubles, concluding that notwithstanding slavery and colonialism, Africans had squandered their opportunities, gambling away their future and betting on high-risk socialist experimentation. How am I doing on time? Oh, okay. I'm rushing a little bit, but my approach here is clearly influenced by Trouillot's incisive discussion of silencing processes. but I'm trying to push his insights a bit further by highlighting the correspondence between geopolitical realities, ideology, and scholarly tendencies. They are in dialogue and often move in concert. As such, there's deep irony in the positions of those who critiqued the so-called nationalist scholarship of the 1960s, who railed against the agendas and romanticism of the nationalists and Pan-Africanists, but who failed to recognize how their own approach is just as impacted by the politics of their own day, by the failure of the Soviet Union, triumph of global capitalism, by the move to the right of much of the politics in both the United States and Europe, fueled by faltering economies, immigration issues, and the fight against so-called radical Islam. My contention is that if there is justification for critiquing nationalist writers for being participatory in a bygone era, it defies reason to assume that contemporary scholars are somehow immune to their own political and social environments, and that those influences do not manifest in their writings. And so it is that much of recent African scholarship historicizes ongoing challenges by locating their origin in some antecedent time before the present, resituating causality within the continent as opposed to outside of it. As the servile trade in Africans and colonial rule are facts around which it is difficult to maneuver, this approach does not deny European involvement, but in the name of moving beyond such expended categories as victimization and dependency, such scholarship instead envisions an African past in which decisions and regimes of oppression were co-authored, jointly developed. In this way, and in the cause of restoring African agency, the latter is depicted as fully participatory in not only the slave trade, but colonialism itself. The approach is facilitated by a new lexicon that helps to frame the debate, featuring such concepts as entanglement, contingency, malleability, interdependency, negotiation, accommodation. By virtue of adopting such language, assumptions and framing are mistaken for verity and rarely challenged. In this new forest of symbols, Africans emerge as veritable equal players in the most debilitating of processes, leaving one to wonder whether colonialism and slave trades were in any way impositional. In tandem with the Africanist literature, the scholarship on the African diaspora, on the Atlantic world, and in slavery studies also often begins with full African participation in the transatlantic trade as premise, proceeding to weave tales whose effect is to argue that although enslaved and otherwise oppressed, the African descendant had substantial, if not enormous, say over the circumstances of their lives. The entanglement, contingency, malleability of the African context is replaced or corresponded to with such concepts as nuance, reverse agency, collaboration, indeterminacy, resulting in a vocabulary of symmetry on both sides of the Atlantic. This is not to say that these concepts have no validity, as it stands to reason that historical relationships ensued in which there were elements of contingency, accommodation, agency. But we do violence to the historical realities when we suggest equivalencies between those empowered and those disempowered, that power and privilege were entirely the consequence of negotiation between equals. This applies especially to the transatlantic trade in human beings, where the case has been made that Europeans and Africans were equal commercial partners. They were not equal commercial partners. They were neither equal in seafaring experience, nor in capitalizing the slaving venture, nor in controlling the terms of the trade, and they certainly were not equals with respect to the trade's benefits. Emphases that envision colonialism as a partnership are also misleading, as they imply processes of reciprocity. Exchange clearly took place, but it is irresponsible to ever depreciate the circumstances of their unfolding. Beyond context of scholarly production, we must also more carefully examine the complex nature of the African contribution in the Americas. Those contributions are myriad and significant, with Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Venezuela, Suriname, Costa Rica, Panama as leading examples, while it goes without saying that the Caribbean is a region in which a thorough Africanization has taken place, notwithstanding the complex societies of Trinidad, Tobago, and Guyana. Mention of Guyana underscores the artificiality of regional constructs, obscuring what has been the actual experience of the people. We cannot properly understand culture and society in Trinidad without taking into consideration its relationship with Venezuela. We distort the historical process when we discuss Cuba without taking into full account large-scale immigration from the English-speaking Caribbean, especially Jamaica. Nor can we fully understand the dynamics of 18th century Saint-Domingue without taking into consideration the substantial number of enslaved persons surreptitiously transferred there from Jamaica on an annual basis. Speaking of Saint-Domingue, recent research demonstrates that the border between Haiti and Dominican Republic has been more than porous, that the relationship between these two countries is far more intricate and involved than political demagoguery would have us imagine. And then there are the examples of Curacao, Aruba, Bonaire. How else can we explain the rise of Papiamento, in which one hears Spanish, Portuguese, in addition to Dutch, without reference to the South American mainland? Speaking about migrations, African populations have been in perpetual motion for centuries, from island to island, from island to mainland, vice versa, and in pursuing economic opportunities, have helped to knit the Americas together. This is to say nothing of the Caribbean's contribution to North America, to what becomes the United States and Canada. Indeed, as we speak, the entire concept of African Americanness must be rethought, especially in light of what's happening in leading colleges and universities, where the collective black student profile has become highly diverse, as an ever-growing percentage hail from the Caribbean and/or Africa. And of course, the study of the diaspora is not confined to the Atlantic, but rather encompasses much of the globe, from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. By way of slave trades and commerce, Africans found themselves in the Persian Gulf, in India, in Iran, in what became Turkey, and so forth. The African presence in Europe can be traced to antiquity, after which there has probably never been a period since in which Africans were not there. The research is only beginning regarding the experience of the Persian Gulf, where the African presence is pervasive and unmistakable. And then there's the so-called new African diaspora, set into motion following the Second World War, when large numbers relocated from the colonies of the Caribbean and Africa to the metropole. This raises hard questions. Are they part of the preceding African diaspora, or do they constitute another? Is there any compelling reason to even classify their experiences as diasporic, when they may more readily be understood within the category of immigration studies? Are not the challenges and difficulties faced by African immigrants more akin to those from Asia and Middle East? And do they not, in fact, have more in common with them than with African descendant communities who precede them by centuries? To what extent do they participate in the experience of loss and exile? And though return may be difficult, in some cases impossible, is return in any way similar to the unattainable, quixotic quality of the earlier diaspora? Does it function in the imaginary in the same way? In what ways are contemporary African immigrants and their predecessors related, quote unquote? What do these Africas really have in common? These are all important questions that challenge the concept of diaspora. My own orientation is to identify the many areas in which these communities are in fact articulated. But in response to these queries, we attend to the ways in which current renderings of geopolitics often exclude and occlude. The account of America's founding, for example, characteristically features earnest pilgrims seeking religious freedom, opening the way for our hardscrabble pioneers who, by dint of their work ethic and innovation, inexorably blazed paths through which millions of European immigrants, and to a lesser extent Asians, entered into the 19th and 20th centuries. This tidy narrative of Western progress and civilization conveniently omits, however, that in addition to the displacement of First Nation societies, it was Africans and their descendants who were the America's largest immigrant population prior to the early 19th century. That before 1820, 3 times as many captive Africans as Europeans crossed the Atlantic. Some 80% of all Africans made the fateful voyage between 1701 and 1850. In comparison with the trade in Africans through the Sahara, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean, the bulk of the Atlantic trade took less than 1/10 of the time, with some 45% imported into Brazil alone. That part of the Caribbean in which the English, French, and Dutch languages became dominant yet transformed through African inflections, syntaxes, and vocabularies was not far behind Brazil, receiving 37% of the trade in more or less equal proportions. Spanish claimed lands accounted for 12% of the Africans, after which North America took in less than 4%. Though constrained, Africans were among the original trailblazers, and that part of the history needs to be told. In a similar fashion, too many discussions of the Age of Revolution regard Haiti as a high-end slave revolt, as opposed to a veritable revolution itself, arguably the boldest of attempts at fundamental political and social change the hemisphere has ever witnessed. And if one insists on featuring the French Revolution, is it not fair to interrogate the basis for the emergence of the third estate, and to ask, from where did the wealth of the merchant classes of Bordeaux and Nantes come, if not principally from slaving in the sugarcane fields of Saint-Domingue? in presenting Simon Bolivar as the great liberator, let us not forget that the core of his troops were Afro-descendants, and that in his darkest hour, he received sustenance and support from Haiti, something he conveniently forgot in his hour of triumph. In the midst of all of the glory, repression, and bigotry, we need to remember how those of African descent gave their all to the extent allowed in world wars. This obviously applies not only to the United States, but also to Europe, where African participation in World War was extraordinary, but where the resistance under de Gaulle in the 20th century, like Bolivar in the 19th, was saved by African troops prior to the whitening, the replacement of Africans with Europeans in the winter of 1944-45, following the defeat of the Germans at Normandy, where only white troops participated in the triumphal return to Paris. This is not a matter of political correctness, but rather one of accuracy, of telling the truth. There is now added urgency to the need, and I'm almost done now. There is now added urgency to the need to reposition the self in relation to the dominant narrative, as we have entered into a period in which the West's wrestling with the consequences of empire has reached a defining moment, in which former subjects are striving to move to the other side of the ledger for inclusion as full citizens and compatriots. But this is taking place concomitantly with the anxieties of a working class, especially whites, who have experienced the diminution of their circumstances in the face of globalization's withering force. The expression of how these anxieties has an unmistakable quality of xenophobia, sexism, misogyny, and racism. In a context of shrinking resources and opportunities, the question of who should benefit turns on the familiar insider-outsider dichotomy. Who is a citizen, who is a foreigner, and the demand for state protection against outsiders. Africans and their descendants are included in the crosshairs, as the African American has long occupied the status of the domestic foreigner. Now more than ever, she must engage the question, how might I participate in the debates and struggles over the meaning of citizenship, with charges of illegality and terrorism flying in every direction, such that a conjoined agenda of social justice and equity is advanced? The historian, and by extension the scholar, willingly or not, wittingly or not, will necessarily participate in this discussion. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to take questions? Okay. Questions. Do you have any questions for me? Any disagreements?
Wow. Yeah.
Will any of your speech appear in print before long? Or has some of it appeared in print?
It has not appeared in print, Professor Stuckey, and I don't know about it. Much depends on the response here. So, yes.
Thank you very much. It was an enormously big picture, and so I was just struggling to try and recognize some of the major currents and debates that you were identifying. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sensing a little quibble in there with post-colonial historiography, and I didn't hear an identification of two key names that were logical in what you were describing. Fanon, tradition of intellectual thought of Fanon, and also Stuart Hall. So tell me, is that a quibble of yours, or where do they fit into intellectual history? And did I detect some of the argument against post-colonial studies in some way?
No, you didn't detect that. I don't have an issue. As a matter of fact, I concede and conceded in a certain part at an early juncture in the presentation that the preoccupation with post-colonial studies makes all the sense in the world. I understand that. My concerns have to do with the ways in which Africanists tend to articulate the African experience with these studies. And I think that in the interest of trying to identify nodal points of comparison and correspondence. And I think I do take issue with a kind of tendency to not take into full consideration the ways in which the various African experiences may be exceptional and call for so that it's certainly proper to embed, okay, the study of Africa within post-colonial studies, but at the same time, the study of Africa, I contend, has some rather unique experiences which need to be understood in their own terms. Yes, Professor.
First, wow. Thank you.
Okay.
I will go further to say it's a profound mistake on the part of Africans to engage in the project and theorization of issues about Africa and Africans in the context of post-colonial theory. Here's why. Africa was first mercantilized, and then the space, the science of where was created by Europeans, right? When they handed over the space to Africans, the space remained contained in the same format it was created in 1884-85. What is it that holds together the framework of mercantilism, colonialism, and so-called independence? Structures of power. Structures of power, as Dr. Sheila reminded us yesterday, going back to 1867, marks discussion of dispossessing processes. What you just articulated here brings us back full circle. The dispossessing of knowledge. The dispossessing of knowledge. And therefore the dispossessing of the identity, security, integrity of the African human essence. Partly explaining why African studies across this country is vastly irrelevant in many schools in terms of the intellectual philosophy of the different institutions. Partly explaining the absence of serious intellectual discussions after independence in many African universities. Where those existed, the structure of power that dispossesses us of this relevant structural adjustment policies simply took the state out, took the resources out, and dismembered the evolution of what was becoming a true intellectual powerhouse in places like Makerere, in places like Ibadan, in Soka, and elsewhere. Not to talk about Timbuktu and Songhai and what have you. So, again, that intersection, that power structure. For example, British East India Company is directly responsible for the revolution in this country. But the same British India Company gave birth to United African Company. United African Company gave birth to Johnson, Glover, and then Liver Brothers. Other companies that are still there. So what I'm saying is perhaps we need to think about what ended, if anything. Just a comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, my question relates to the more recent development. You know, I had a conversation with you at lunch, and my question is about talking about the recent African immigrants and their experience in the Americas, especially in the United States. I've been looking at the Ethiopian immigrants in the U.S., and I'm one of those people who use this term, the new African diaspora. So, but you are problematizing that phrase now. So are you saying that the experience of loss and exile is the only defining element to describe or articulate anybody's diasporic experience?
Well, I think that certainly this sense of loss and dispossession certainly is at the core of the earlier iteration, if you will, of the African diaspora. I think the challenge is to take more time to think about the ways in which the post-1945 experience may or may not relate to this earlier experience. I think that we can find many, many ways, many, many instances, and many, many reasons for bringing these experiences together. But the thing is, I'm quite aware of the varying positions on this, and that there's no agreement, as to how, in fact, quote unquote, conventionally defined African Americans relate or do not relate to, Africans born in the continent and so forth. This is an ongoing kind of conversation. And what's interesting as well is that when you come into the United States, when you're a place like the United States, where racial categories have such a premium, and everything tends to be funneled. Social relations tend to be funneled through racial lenses, right? Or seen through racial lenses, and so people who were from different places, who never necessarily thought of themselves, at least very much, as belonging to a race or being black or being Asian. You hear this all the time. All of a sudden, in the U.S., they become this thing. And so now they have to figure out, okay, so what is my relationship to this? And, it's a kind of ongoing conversation. With that said, there's a rich history of people of African descent coming together, forming solidarities in common structures, common formations, based upon a common sense or related sense of struggle. And so I think that we need to think a little more carefully about that. So I don't have a ready-made answer for you, because I'm not, who's the arbiter of that? I'm not the arbiter of that. If someone who's born in Africa says, I'm African American, fine. I'm good with that. There are historical reasons why that claim could be valid. If someone says, well, I was born someplace and I'm here, but I really don't identify with this notion of being African American. I understand African American. I understand that too.
Right, but just in terms of how to articulate the experience, I'm just seeking help here.
Yeah. I think that's I don't know that we have the time. I think that that is a conversation that we need to have, but it's a conversation that is unfolding probably on your campus, on campuses represented, in this room. They certainly are unfolding at NYU. And there are other communities involved here, right? And so you have other communities of African descent. And where do they fit into this question as well? People from the Caribbean, people from Spanish-speaking America. People, it's an interesting conversation. Yeah. So diaspora has this elasticity to it, and yeah.
You brought up, you problematized it very nicely and very clearly.
Yes.
The categories and the terms, the terminologies in
Yes.
which we think, coin our thinking.
Yes.
And to me, it's always seemed that diaspora feeds into a certain type
racial thinking that I would hope we would overcome. You call it the underbelly of the beast.
Mm-hmm.
So I would start with finding new terms, new categories. It's probably easier said than done, but I think it would be a step in the right direction. Because it still has this, diaspora has a funny undertone to it.
Okay.
Something that, the polarity between colonial, post-colonial, that's
Yeah.
a temporal thing.
Yeah.
But there's colonial and there's diaspora.
Yeah.
And that creates a disparity in its own, I think.
Yes.
So the terms need to be rethought and
Yeah.
revised.
Yeah, so there's and I think concepts like diaspora have a tendency to, the danger in it is to homogenize these experiences.
Yeah.
When they which does violence to the realities. Yeah. But at the same time, these conversations are taking place within a certain kind of political climate, context, and so forth, which cannot be dismissed. And so we need to. It's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. Yes.
I was just piggybacking on the next comment because it's not anything that I have an answer for, but certainly something I've been thinking about for a long time. And that is that we tend to focus on the present political, historical moments about some of these conversations. But historically, when we look at communities and their relation with origins, places of migration, in one place I think about African families in the Dominican Republic originally, and it was like re-finding the Dominican Republic in New Orleans when I went there and started to read and see some things that really brought the revolutionary period of the island to life for me in a location I never would have expected. And it often has left me thinking about, not just so much in the context of diaspora, as more of how we're talking about how migrant communities really continue to engage places of origin, even in second and third generation. And I don't know that I can call it diaspora, because diaspora to me signifies almost kind of relocation and separation, as opposed to ongoing political and emotional engagement. And I certainly feel that as a second generation. I'll be making a final comment at the end of this period to explain my views. But I think we have, and I think W. E. Du Bois was one of those leading scholars who had a thinking in this way, which is, the place and the question of ongoing political engagement between communities, even after you have parts of families move, but yet there's an ongoing umbilical connection.
Yeah. I was thinking about Said as you were talking about that. Toward the end of his life, Said had begun to theorize about exile as a kind of permanent place. And I think that in, for example, a place like the United States, people of African descent are experiencing this place very differently. Very, very differently. And for some, this is exile. It's exile. For others, it's a new homeland. For others who are much more transnational, people are moving back and forth, trying to figure out what that means. So there is no one experience. And you mentioned Dominican Republic, and we can talk about Dominican Republic too, with respect to diaspora and how it fits in and doesn't fit in. So, yeah. One more question, I think. Yep, Nina?
First of all, thank you for that magisterial presentation.
Oh, that was very kind of you.
I just had two different kinds of thoughts, one about diaspora, just quickly, and one about history and capitalism. In terms of diaspora, I mean, it seems to me that you were moving with and building from both Stuart Hall's sense of diaspora, not as about culture, but about multiple positions of dispossession. That's what he's doing with it.
Mm-hmm.
In very different uses of a concept in diaspora.
Mhm.
Both seem to run through your work.
Mhm.
And I tell the name of you know, I don't know, in terms of
Some folks I'll name, some folks I won't name.
well, I just-
But,
I'm just
yeah.
but following up. But
Yeah.
also, Eric Williams' work on capitalism and slavery
Yes.
has recently, through a number of works on American history, really been substantiated and verified, and more in terms of the absolute central role of slavery in building American capitalism and leading to the American Revolution and the Republican form of government, you know, and the birth of England. And I wondered how that played into the work.
Well, I'm happy to I'm happy to hear, you know, this validation of Eric Williams, because in other circles the debate continues. Yeah, I don't think that we have to have a model of either or with respect to how communities relate, right? And so I understand that some of what I've said has to do, may sound like Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy and so forth. I don't necessarily, so I agree with some of what they say, disagree with a lot of what they say. I think that there are structural, there are structural issues with respect to cultural expressions that these communities events that I think escape, you know, a kind of Gilroyan analysis, and that those are things that, you know, I talk about as well in my work. No question about it, though, capitalism is something that is very critical to the formation of these communities. No, and I agree with that. And yeah, so I alluded to this. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.